Good evening and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we are traveling somewhere strange, a world where a stranger could look at the shape of your ear, the dampness of your palm, or the speed of your blink, and decide with total confidence that you were a liar. Victorian Britain believed the truth could be read off the human body like text off a page. No trial was needed. No confession was needed. Just a steady stare, a measuring tape, and a great deal of misplaced certainty. Before we drift into it, if this kind of slow, detailed history helps you unwind, consider leaving the video on low volume and letting it carry you off. There's no need to catch every word. Your body will do the listening for you. Now settle in. Let the room go quiet. Let your breathing slow. And try, if you can, to keep a calm, unreadable face, because in the century we're about to enter, even a flicker of nervousness was treated as a signed confession. Have you ever wondered what people did before there were lie detectors, before there was DNA, before there was any real forensic science at all? How did a Victorian shopkeeper decide whether to trust a customer? How did a mother decide whether her son was telling the truth about where he'd been? How did a courtroom full of men in wigs decide who deserved to hang? The answers, as you're about to discover, involved skulls, sweat, ink blots, hypnotized volunteers, and on at least one occasion a photograph of a ghost. So close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up in the year 1860. You are lying in a narrow bed in a cold room under a heavy quilt that smells faintly of coal smoke. Outside your window, a gas lamp hisses on the street corner. Somewhere below, a kettle is beginning to sing. And somewhere in the city, in every city like it, a great many people are quietly convinced that they can tell, just by looking at you, whether you are the sort of person who can be trusted. Welcome to Victorian England. Here, honesty is not assumed. It is investigated, measured, weighed, and occasionally massaged out of your skull by a man with surprisingly confident hands. Let's understand, gently, why an entire nation became so fixated on catching liars. This is a century drunk on discovery. Trains thunder across the countryside at speeds no human body has ever traveled before. The telegraph carries messages faster than any horse could run. Chemists are numbing elements. Geologists are reading the age of the earth in layers of rock. It is, quite genuinely, an age in which science feels like magic that actually works. And so it seems only reasonable to the Victorian mind that if you can weigh a star or map a coastline, you should certainly be able to measure a man's character. Underneath all this optimism sits a harder, more anxious truth. Victorian society is obsessed with respectability, and respectability is fragile. A person's entire future, their marriage prospects, their employment, their place at the dinner table, can rest on their reputation for honesty. And reputation, once damaged, is almost impossible to repair. So the fear of being deceived runs very deep indeed. Fear of the business partner who might vanish with the accounts. Fear of the servant who might slip a spoon into an apron pocket. Fear of the charming stranger who turns out to be after nothing but your daughter's inheritance. Faced with all this fear, and armed with a century's worth of scientific confidence, the Victorians did what they always did. They tried to solve it with a system. Several systems, actually, most of them wrong, some of them cruel, and one or two of them, almost by accident, pointing toward the future of real forensic science. Tonight, we'll walk through 15 or so of these systems, one by one. We'll meet the men who invented them, the reasoning, however shaky, behind each one, and what it might have actually felt like to sit across from an examiner who believed your nose could betray your soul. Let's begin with the face, because in Victorian England, everyone else certainly did. The reading of the face long before you ever spoke a word to a stranger in this era, your features had likely already been quietly judged. This practice was called physiognomy, the confident belief that a person's moral character could be read directly from the shape and arrangement of their face. It treated the human head as a kind of open book, one that any sufficiently observant gentleman could learn to read. The idea itself was ancient, stretching back to the Greeks, but it found its most influential modern voice in a Swiss pastor named Johann Caspar Lavater, writing in the late 18th century. Lavater produced a lavishly illustrated set of volumes on the subject, filled with engraved faces sorted by their supposed moral qualities: the noble, the weak, the cunning, the virtuous. These books were wildly popular, and by the time Victoria took the throne, physiognomy had settled comfortably into the mainstream of polite society. It wasn't considered fringe or eccentric. It was considered by a great many educated people simply good sense. Picture, then, what it might have been like to be evaluated this way. A gentleman studies your forehead. A high, broad brow was thought to indicate intelligence and nobility of mind, while a low or sloping one suggested something closer to brutishness. He studies the distance between your eyes set too close together, and you were marked as sly, grasping, untrustworthy. He studies your chin. A strong, well-defined chin spoke of resolve and honesty. A soft or receding one suggested weakness of character, and weakness of character, in the physiognomist's mind, slid very easily into dishonesty. Even your nose did not escape examination. A straight nose was virtuous. A hooked nose was calculating. An upturned nose suggested impertinence. None of this had the faintest basis in anything you had ever done. It was simply the bone structure you happened to be born with, inspected and moralized over as though you had personally selected it from a catalog. And here is the deep unfairness sitting at the heart of physiognomy. There was no way to argue your way out of it. You could not rearrange your own skull. If your features were heavy and strong, you were read as coarse. If they were delicate and uneven, you were read as sneaky. Either way, the verdict had effectively been handed down before you'd said a single word about yourself. It's also worth noticing, quietly, the way any thoughtful person eventually did, that the honest, noble faces in Lavater's engravings tended to resemble well-fed English or European gentlemen of a particular class, while the villainous faces tended to resemble the poor, the foreign, and the exhausted. Physiognomy, in other words, was frequently just ordinary prejudice, dressed up in the borrowed authority of science. It let people feel scientific about opinions they already held. And yet it mattered enormously in daily life. Employers passed over decent applicants because they didn't care for the set of their mouth. Landladies turned away respectable travelers because their eyes sat the wrong distance apart. A kind, honest man with an unfortunate nose might spend his whole life quietly fighting an assumption he never earned and could never shed. So there you would sit or stand, while a stranger studied your bones and pronounced judgment on your soul confidently, completely, and without a shred of doubt. And whatever he decided, you would simply have to carry it with you out the door. The reading of the scullif your face alone wasn't invasive enough. The Victorians developed an entire discipline devoted to touching your head. This was phrenology, the theory that the brain was not a single organ, but a collection of separate mental organs, each governing a particular trait, and each one, if sufficiently developed, pressing outward against the skull to form a small, detectable bump. Phrenology traced its origins to a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall, working around the turn of the 19th century. Gall proposed that traits like benevolence, secretiveness, destructiveness, and conscientiousness each had their own dedicated region of the brain, and that a skilled examiner, running careful fingers over a person's scalp, could detect which faculties were strong and which were weak simply by feeling for the corresponding swell of bone. His followers built elaborate charts of the head, dividing the skull into dozens of neatly labeled zones. And crucially for our purposes tonight, one of those zones tucked just above the ear was labeled secretiveness. A large bump there, so the theory went, marked a person inclined toward concealment, evasion, and yes, dishonesty. Picture, then, submitting to an examination. The phrenologist works his fingertips slowly across your scalp in careful circles, murmuring to himself as he goes, as though reading a language only he understood. He pauses above your temple. Strong secretiveness, he notes gravely. You're the sort who keeps things hidden. He moves on, brightened slightly. Good conscientiousness, however. Then his brow furrows again. A troubling degree of acquisitiveness. You may be inclined to take what isn't yours. You have said nothing this entire time. Your skull, apparently, has been doing all the talking. What's striking about phrenology's popularity is just how respectable it became. Phrenological societies opened in major cities. Practitioners set up shop on fashionable streets. Anxious parents brought their children in to have their futures assessed by skull. Some employers requested a phrenological reading before hearing domestic staff. Ceramic phrenology heads, painted with all those neat little labeled regions, became genuine parlor decor, sitting on mantelpieces as conversation pieces in homes that considered themselves thoroughly modern. The trouble, of course, is that none of it corresponds to anything real. The brain does not press outward through the skull in tidy, individually mapped lumps of virtue and vice. Skull shape is influenced by genetics, by the process of bone growth, by simple individual variation, not by the relative strength of your honesty. The organ of secretiveness was no more real than a sea monster sketched into the corner of an old sailing chart. But belief, as we'll see again and again tonight, does not require evidence. It only requires enough confident people repeating the same idea in the same certain tone. So you would sit, patiently, faintly embarrassed, while fingers traced the invisible geography of your character. The phrenologist would deliver his conclusions with total gravity to a room full of listening guests, and someone in that room, hearing that your skull suggested weak honesty, might quietly decide never again to lend you money. The testimony of a blush. Whatever else happened to you tonight, you were told, under no circumstances, to blush. In the Victorian mind, a blush was not simple embarrassment. It was read as the physical proof of a cracking conscience, the truth trying to force its way out through the skin itself. It didn't matter that you might blush purely from the discomfort of being stared at by a room full of people waiting for exactly that reaction. The rising color was treated as its own verdict, arriving before you'd had the chance to say a single word in your defense. The blush fascinated the great minds of the age precisely because it seemed so uniquely human. Charles Darwin himself gave the subject serious study, describing blushing as one of the strangest and most distinctly human of all expressions, noting that no other animal does it, and that no person, however skilled a liar, can simply summon a blush at will. And that observation, ironically, is exactly what made the blush so dangerous as a lie detection tool. Since it couldn't be faked into existence, people assumed it also couldn't be suppressed by an innocent person trying desperately not to show one. The harder you fought to keep your color steady, the more certainly it would rise, rather like being told not to picture something, and finding you can picture nothing else. Imagine a dinner party where a valuable brooch has gone missing. Someone mentions it, then lets a silence fall, glancing slowly around the table. Everyone at that table knows exactly what is happening. Everyone knows that the first face to color will be quietly, silently convicted in the minds of the other guests. And so, of course, you feel the heat begin to rise in your own cheeks, not from guilt, but from the sheer unbearable pressure of being watched for exactly this reaction by a dozen expectant eyes. This test punished precisely the wrong people. A shy, sensitive person who blushed at the slightest attention lived under a permanent cloud of unearned suspicion. A modest young woman who colored at a bold remark was quietly filed away as hiding something. Meanwhile, the truly practiced liar, calm, composed, entirely unbothered by conscience, sailed through untouched, pale and steady, because his circulation had simply never learned to betray him. There's a real cruelty buried in this one. A blush is, if anything, one of the most honest reactions the human body produces, an involuntary flicker of feeling that cannot be summoned or faked. And the Victorians took that most sincere of signals and turned it into evidence of dishonesty, punishing people for the one part of their face least capable of lying to begin with. So you would sit, willing the blood to stay exactly where it belonged, feeling it rise regardless, betrayed in the end by your own circulatory system. The judgment of the eyes. Now, where do you look? This is a trap, and there is no correct answer to it. Meet a stranger's gaze too steadily, and you are marked as a bold, practiced liar. Look away, even briefly, and you are marked as a nervous, guilty one. Blink too often, and you are hiding something. Blink too rarely and your unnatural calm becomes suspicious in its own right. The Victorian conviction that the eyes are the windows of the soul meant that every glance you made in company was being quietly scored, like a card game you never agreed to sit down and play. The eyes carried enormous symbolic weight in this century. Poets wrote of them endlessly. Moralists preached about them from the pulpit. And there existed a broad, almost universal agreement that an honest person looked you directly in the face, while a dishonest one could not quite manage it. A steady gaze was proof of good character. A wandering one was proof of a shifting, unreliable soul. Mothers drilled this lesson into their children with real seriousness. Look at me when you speak, as though truth lived somewhere behind the eyeball and could be shaken loose through sheer eye contact. The trouble is that real human eyes refuse to cooperate with this tidy theory. An entirely honest person accused of something they didn't do will very often look away out of simple discomfort, or a kind of instinctive shame at being suspected at all. A practiced liar, by contrast, has usually learned exactly the opposite lesson, that a steady, unwavering gaze is precisely what an accuser wants to see, and so he supplies it without effort. The test, in practice, rewards confident deception and punishes anxious innocence. It gets the whole matter backwards, and does so with total confidence. Picture standing before a stern employer or a suspicious magistrate, knowing full well that your eyes are being read like tea leaves in a cup. You try to hold his gaze, but that begins to feel aggressive, so you soften it slightly. Now you appear to be glancing away, which looks evasive, so you snap your eyes back too quickly, which looks panicked. There is no natural way to look at a person who is openly studying you for the signs of a lie. It's a bit like trying to walk normally while someone films your feet and narrates every single step aloud. The examination went further still. Victorian observers studied the pupils, noting how they widened or shrank, reading fear or desire into every small flicker. They timed how long a person held eye contact before breaking it, and noted how often a gaze darted toward the door, as though longing for escape were itself proof of guilt. Some claimed that looking up and to the side while answering a question was a telltale sign, as though the truth were written somewhere on the ceiling, and a lie hid somewhere off in the corner. Entire conclusions were drawn from a moment's flick of the eyes that, in truth, meant nothing more than a passing noise, a shift in the light, or simply the ordinary movement of a person's eyes doing what eyes do. So you would sit, quietly managing your own gaze like a nervous puppeteer, trying to strike some impossible balance between too steady and too shifting, too still and too restless. And somewhere across the room, someone would be nodding to themselves, entirely certain they had just caught the precise moment your soul flickered. It would not matter if you were innocent as morning. In this century, the eyes were always called to testify, and they were remarkably unreliable witnesses who somehow never faced any real cross-examination. The born criminal across the water in Italy, a prison physician named Cesare Lombroso, had arrived at a striking and troubling conclusion, that certain people were simply born as criminals, identifiable by physical traits alone, long before they had ever committed a single wrongful act. His theory, which he called criminal anthropology, spread across Europe with remarkable speed during the latter half of the century, and it would leave a long, damaging shadow. Lombroso worked as a physician within the Italian prison system, and by his own account, the theory came to him almost as a flash of insight while examining the skull of a notorious criminal. Something about its shape, he decided, echoed features he associated with earlier, more primitive stages of human development, a kind of biological throwback. From that single observation, he built an entire elaborate system. The born criminal, in Lombroso's framework, was a person biologically stranded in humanity's savage past, identifiable by a collection of physical signs he termed stigmata: heavy, jutting brows, unusually large jaws, asymmetrical ears, unusually long arms, and a reduced sensitivity to pain, among others. Enough of these traits together in Lombroso's system marked a person as a criminal type, regardless of whether they had ever actually broken the law. To support this theory, he measured many hundreds of imprisoned men, filling careful notebooks with the dimensions of skulls, jaws, hands, and faces, thoroughly convinced that the numbers would eventually confess what the men themselves would not. On paper, the work looked genuinely rigorous. There were charts, photographs, painstaking tables of figures. And that appearance of rigor is precisely what made it so dangerous, because it looked enough like real science that a great many people trusted it without question, never quite noticing the enormous flaw sitting at its center. Lombroso studied only men who had already been convicted and imprisoned, then declared their physical features to be the cause of their crimes, rather than pausing to ask whether poverty, hunger, or simple bad luck might have had rather more to do with landing them in a cell. The consequences of this reasoning rippled outward in genuinely harmful ways. If criminality was simply inherited, written into the body from birth, then reform began to seem pointless, and mercy began to seem naive. Judges in several countries began to hear arguments that certain defendants were, by their very nature, beyond hope. And entire groups of people, the poor, recent immigrants, anyone whose features differed from the presumed European ideal, found their perfectly ordinary faces rebranded as evidence of a criminal type. A tired laborer with a heavy brow and large hands might be eyed with suspicion for the crime of resembling a drawing in a book written by a man who had only ever studied convicted prisoners. It's worth noting, in fairness, that Lombroso did not see himself as cruel. He genuinely believed his theory pointed toward a more humane system, arguing that if criminals were born rather than made, they ought to be treated and managed rather than simply punished. But the practical effect of the idea was to turn appearance into evidence and birth into destiny, handing every existing prejudice a fresh scientific costume to wear in public. Later researchers, applying more careful statistical methods, would go on to thoroughly dismantle Lombroso's claims, but not before his theories had shaped courtrooms, prisons, and public attitudes across an entire continent for decades. So there you might have stood, aware that a distinguished Italian doctor had, in a real sense, put ordinary human faces on trial across Europe. Whatever you had or had not done, the slope of your forehead and the set of your jaw were being read as clues to a crime you might never commit. And the worst part, perhaps, is how convincing the whole system sounded, right up until you remembered that a face has never once, in the entire history of the world, managed to commit a robbery entirely on its own. The measurements of a man in France, a records clerk named Alphonse Berthelin, had grown thoroughly weary of criminals lying about their names. Working within a Paris police office, he was buried under a mounting pile of essentially useless paper records, men arrested again and again, each time giving a different false name, with no reliable way to know whether the person standing before him was a genuine first offender or a hardened repeat criminal on his 12th arrest. It was, by his own account, a maddening problem, and so he set out to solve it not through any reading of character, but through cold, precise measurement. Berthelin reasoned that, while a man could change his name as easily as he might change his coat, he could not so easily change the underlying architecture of his own body. He devised a system of 11 separate measurements, taken with specialized calipers and gauges by trained officers: height, both sitting and standing, the reach of the outstretched arms, the length and width of the head, the length of the left foot, the length of the left forearm, the length of the left little finger, and a particular point of pride for Berthelin, the dimensions of the ear, which he believed to be as distinctive and unchanging as what we would now call a fingerprint. Each set of measurements was recorded on a card, and the cards were filed numerically, so that any repeat offender, however many false names he gave, could in principle be identified again simply by remeasuring him and matching the resulting figures. Picture, then, submitting to this process. An officer clamps a cold metal instrument against your skull and reads off its width. He stretches your arms wide to measure their full span. He grips your ear between careful fingers and measures it from top to bottom with the same clinical attention one might give to weighing potatoes. You are turned, positioned, and recorded, piece by piece, until you have effectively been reduced to a short row of numbers on a stiff card. There is something quietly dehumanizing about it, a bit like being disassembled into a list. Have you ever filled out a form so exhaustive it felt as though the form somehow knew you better than you knew yourself? Now imagine that form built entirely from the measurements of your own body. For a time, the system, which came to be known as Bertollinage, worked remarkably well, and Bertolin became genuinely famous for it. Police forces across Europe and beyond adopted the method, and repeat offenders who had once slipped through the system under false names began to be caught out by the simple, unchanging measurements of their own ears and forearms. It represented a real step towards something recognizably modern, the notion that a person could be reliably identified through the body itself, rather than through whatever story they chose to tell an officer. But the system had real cracks. The measurements demanded exacting precision, and a careless officer using a slightly different technique could easily produce figures that failed to match, potentially freeing a guilty man or wrongly entangling an innocent one. Worse, it gradually became clear that different individuals could occasionally share nearly identical measurements, which rather undermined the entire promise of uniqueness the system had been built on. In time, a simpler and considerably more reliable method, the fingerprint, would quietly push Bertolin's calipers aside for good, though not before his system had shaped policing practice for a generation. So you might leave that office measured, numbered, and carefully filed away, your body transformed into a form of evidence whether or not you had done anything at all. It was the truth hunt turned mechanical, no longer an attempt to read your soul off your face, but an attempt to read your very identity off the length of your forearm. The composite face Francis Galton, a restless polymath and cousin to Charles Darwin, had an idea that captured the imagination of his era. He began stacking photographs of convicted criminals one on top of another, using multiple exposures on a single photographic plate to produce a single blurred composite face, an average villain, as though wickedness itself might sit obligingly for a portrait. He was hunting, quite genuinely, for the look of a liar, the face of a thief, the shared features of the untrustworthy. Galton shared his famous cousin's hunger for data, though he pointed it toward considerably stranger corners of human experience. Convinced that traits of character, much like traits of the body, tended to run in families and reveal themselves in the face, he gathered photographs of men convicted of similar categories of crime and exposed them, one after another, onto a single photographic plate, each for a fraction of a normal exposure time. The features these men shared grew stronger and clearer with each additional exposure. The features where they differed faded gently into a blur. What emerged, after all this careful layering, was a single ghostly composite, an averaged face representing, Galton hoped, the essential and hidden type lurking beneath all those individual heads. His ambitions here were considerable. He hoped that these composites might reveal the true underlying face of criminality, so that ordinary, honest society might learn to recognize wickedness on sight, much as one might learn to identify a particular species of bird from a field guide. He produced composites of violent offenders, of thieves, of the chronically ill, always searching for some telltale stamp of the trait he was investigating. In essence, this was physiognomy again, the same old idea of reading character from the face, but now dressed in the impressive new clothing of photography, a technology the public trusted considerably more than they trusted a mere hand-drawn sketch. And here the whole project quietly stumbled over its own results. When Galton examined his finished composite criminals, he was genuinely startled to find that they did not look monstrous in the least. Blended together, the faces of many convicted men produced something oddly ordinary, even in some cases. Rather pleasant because the individual scars, irregularities, and harsh features of each man washed away in the process of averaging, leaving behind a smooth, unremarkable human face. The distinct criminal type he had set out to capture simply refused to appear. His own method, followed with complete honesty, pointed toward the deeply inconvenient conclusion that criminals looked very much like everyone else. There is a real comedy buried in this. A man built an elaborate photographic apparatus to capture the face of evil itself, and the apparatus kept dutifully returning pictures of a perfectly pleasant stranger. And yet the seductive underlying idea survived the disappointment anyway, because people badly wanted it to be true. The dream that one might glance at a face and read the soul hiding behind it was simply too convenient a notion to abandon, however clearly the evidence argued against it. Galton's blurred composites were studied and discussed in learned circles for years, while the deeper lesson buried inside them, that the criminal has no special, identifiable face at all, was politely set aside. So there you might stand, looking at these strange, smeared, layered portraits, many individual men folded into one, feeling the peculiar ambition behind them. Someone had genuinely believed it possible to photograph dishonesty itself, to pin the liar down to a recognizable shape one might spot across a crowded room, and the resulting plates, to their maker's quiet disappointment, whispered precisely the opposite conclusion. The confession of the pen put down that pen for a moment, because before the ink has even dried, someone nearby may already be studying your loops and slants to decide whether you can be trusted with money, with secrets, or with their family's good opinion of you. Graphology treated a person's handwriting as a direct signature of the soul. A cramped, tight hand supposedly indicated a cramped, tight conscience. A wild, sweeping flourish suggested a wild, unpredictable character. An ordinary grocery list under this system became a full psychological profile you had never agreed to submit for review. The Victorians inherited this idea and refined it into a genuinely fashionable art. In France, a clergyman named Jean-Hippolyte Michon is generally credited with giving the practice its name and its detailed system of rules, publishing charts that paired each particular twist and slope of the pen with a corresponding trait of mind. His followers studied personal letters the way others studied palms, hunting for honesty in the angle of a stroke and for deceit in a hesitant, wavering line. Before long, no fashionable parlor felt complete without someone claiming the ability to read a person's true heart from their penmanship. And no love letter, however sincere, was entirely safe from being quietly dissected for hidden meaning its writer had never intended to reveal. The rules of graphology multiplied endlessly. Slant your writing to the right and you were judged warm and open. Slant it left and you were judged cold and secretive. Press hard on the page and you were passionate or perhaps aggressive. Write lightly and you were sensitive or perhaps simply frail. Leave wide gaps between your words and you were a loner. Crowd your words tightly together and you were needy and clinging. Nearly every conceivable way a person might move a pen across paper had been assigned some meaning, conveniently arranged so that a practicing graphologist always had something to say. A particular obsession among these practitioners was the signature, considered the place where a person's truest self was most likely to reveal itself, and studied with special intensity. A flourish beneath a signature was read as pride. A signature written smaller than the rest of a document suggested false modesty, masking secret ambition. A signature that trailed off at the end suggested a person concealing something. Merchants examined the signatures on contracts not merely to guard against outright forgery, but genuinely to judge the character of the man who had signed, as though his fundamental honesty might be measured in the curl of his final letter. Picture handing over a perfectly ordinary note, only to watch a guest hold it up to the candlelight, tilt his head thoughtfully, and announce that your handwriting reveals a deceitful streak and a tendency toward exaggeration. You had written nothing more than a dinner invitation. It made no difference. The verdict had already been read off your loops. The appeal of graphology is not hard to understand. Handwriting feels deeply personal, and everyone's differs slightly from everyone else's, so it is easy to assume those differences must carry some hidden significance. But in reality, Penmanship is shaped by fairly mundane forces, by the particular school that drilled a child's letters, by the cramp of a tired hand, by the quality of the pen nib and the paper, by whether a person is writing in careful leisure or hurried haste. The soul does not guide the pen, the wrist does. So you might watch a stranger confidently convict your character based on nothing more than a careless scrawl, and feel again the peculiar logic running through this entire century. The conviction that anything a person produces, a face, a skull, a blush, a line of ink, might be seized upon and read aloud as a confession. The racing pulse in a quiet laboratory. An Italian physiologist named Angelo Mosso was watching pulses race and beginning to suspect that fear itself had a rhythm that could be captured on paper. His instrument, the plethysmograph, was a delicate device that traced the rise and fall of a person's pulse as a wavering line, scratched by a fine needle onto a slowly moving strip of paper. Strap it to a person's wrist, ask an uncomfortable question, and watch the needle betray the smallest flutter of a guilty conscience. It was, in many ways, a very early and very distant ancestor of every anxious moment you have ever spent while a machine quietly measured you. The plethysmograph itself was a genuinely clever piece of engineering for its time. Positioned over the pulse point at the wrist, it used a small lever resting against the artery to translate each heartbeat into a moving line, traced by a fine needle onto smoked paper drawn slowly past beneath it. The resulting trace looked something like a jagged mountain range, each peak and valley corresponding to a single beat of the heart. Physicians first used the device simply to study cardiovascular health, observing how the pulse trace changed in illness compared with wellness. But it did not take long for a more tempting application to occur to interested observers. If fear caused the heart to quicken, and if a guilty conscience produced fear when questioned about a crime, then perhaps a machine capable of tracing the pulse might, in effect, trace guilt itself. Mosso, deeply interested in how emotion moved through the body, in the pulse, in the breath, even in the flow of blood to the brain, built increasingly delicate instruments to capture these physical ripples, convinced that the body could not entirely conceal what it felt. Picture yourself as his subject. The strap is fastened snugly around your wrist. The needle settles into its resting rhythm as the paper begins its slow crawl beneath it, tracing the steady, ordinary beat of your resting heart. Then the questions begin. Where were you on the night in question? Do you know the missing man? Did you take the money? And whether or not you had done any of it, your heart, sensing the sheer weight of the moment, gives an involuntary lurch, and the needle scrambles upward across the page in a sharp, jagged spike. There, the accusers might say, pointing triumphantly at the trace, the body has spoken. But of course, the body had spoken a good deal of nonsense, or at least something considerably more tangled than simple guilt. Your heart races when you are afraid, yes, certainly. But it also races when you are merely accused, when you are cold, when you are startled, or when a stranger straps an unfamiliar device to your wrist and asks, in a very serious voice, whether you are a criminal. An entirely innocent person, frightened simply of being wrongly blamed, produces exactly the same wild spike on the paper as a genuinely guilty one. The needle could not distinguish between the fear of being caught and the fear of being falsely condemned. It knew only that the heart had jumped, never why. Still, the underlying dream planted by Mosso's experiments never quite faded. The notion that a machine might read truth directly off the body, catching a lie in the leap of a pulse or a shift in the breath, took root and would go on to grow considerably. In time, it would sprout wires, dials, and eventually a rather more famous American name, and the world would come to call it the lie detector. But it began here, humbly enough, with a strip of smoked paper and a trembling needle, faithfully recording a racing heart while entirely failing to grasp what that racing had actually meant. The swinging coin now, a man is swaying something bright and shining in front of your face, telling you gently to relax, which is, admittedly, one of the more alarming things a stranger can ask of a person. This is mesmerism, or as it later came to be respectably renamed, hypnotism, the belief that a person deep in a trance simply could not lie, because the conscious, calculating part of the mind had been switched off entirely. In theory, the truth was meant to float gently up and out on its own. In practice, subjects tended to either fall genuinely asleep, pretend rather convincingly to fall asleep, or occasionally blurt out something deeply unflattering about a relative. Either way, a fascinated audience was usually watching and taking careful notes. The entire craze traced back to an Austrian physician named Franz Mesmer, who lent the practice his own name along with a considerable amount of theoretical baggage. Mesmer believed in an invisible fluid running through all living things, a force he termed animal magnetism, which a skilled practitioner could supposedly direct and channel through careful passes of the hands, to heal, to soothe, and to guide a willing subject into a strange, drowsy, half-waking state. By the time the practice reached Victorian England, it had been argued over, refined, and partly reconstructed by a Scottish surgeon named James Braid, who renamed it hypnotism, drawing on the Greek word for sleep, in the hope that a more clinical-sounding name might rescue the practice from its association with traveling showmen. The appeal to Victorian truth hunters was fairly obvious. If lying required deliberate, conscious effort, then surely a mind lulled into a trance could no longer manage that effort. Switch off the calculating, self-protective part of a person's mind, the reasoning went, and only plain honesty would remain. So the mesmerist would make his slow, deliberate hand passes, murmur soft and repetitive commands, and tell the subject that their eyelids had grown heavy, that their will was gently melting away. And once the subject appeared to have entered a trance, the practitioner would begin, quite calmly, to ask his questions, fully confident that the answers arriving would be entirely pure and unfiltered. Picture yourself seated in the chair. The room is warm and dim. A pocket watch, or perhaps a bright coin, sways gently before your eyes, and a low, steady voice repeats again and again that you should let go, should sink, should sleep. Perhaps you feel very little and simply grow bored. Perhaps, more genuinely, you feel a real drowsiness settle over you, drifting toward that odd, floating state in which the practitioner's voice seems to come from somewhere very far away. And perhaps, aware that an entire room is watching, hopping for some kind of marvel, you feel a real, quiet pressure to play along, to sway when told to sway and slump when told to slump, because disappointing an eager, expectant room is its own particular kind of social discomfort. Here lies the essential flaw in mesmerism as a genuine test of honesty. A person in a trance, whether the trance is entirely real or partly performed, becomes remarkably suggestible, eager above all to please the very person guiding them through the experience. Ask a leading question, and an entranced subject will very often happily supply whatever answer seems clearly wanted, whether or not it bears any relation to the truth. Far from unlocking sincerity, the trance state could just as easily manufacture a convenient lie on demand, a false memory dressed up, quite convincingly, as a deep and genuine confession. There was real theater in it too, and the theater was very much part of the appeal. Traveling mesmerists toured the country giving public demonstrations, sending volunteers rigid as boards, convincing subjects they had forgotten their own names, persuading them that a raw onion was in fact a delicious apple. Crowds gasped appropriately. Have you ever watched someone grow so eager to be part of a performance that they essentially became whatever the performer needed them to be? Now multiply that natural human eagerness by a darkened room and a genuinely persuasive voice, and you begin to understand the mesmerist's peculiar power. So you might rise from the chair afterward, groggy or simply a little embarrassed, having supposedly bared your innermost soul to a swinging coin. In truth, you may have revealed nothing whatsoever, or, more troublingly, you may have obligingly confessed to something that had never actually happened at all. The trance did not open some hidden window onto sincere honesty. It opened a door through which suggestion could quietly walk in, take a comfortable seat, and begin doing all the talking on your behalf. A tribunal of the dead, the lights sink low. Hands joined together around a small table in the dark, and someone, in a hushed and solemn voice, announces that the departed are about to settle the matter once and for all. In an age genuinely captivated by spiritualism, the séance was often treated as a kind of informal courtroom, with the spirits of the dead serving as star witnesses. Need to know whether a business partner was quietly cheating you? Ask the spirits. A medium moans softly. A table tips of its own accord. A bell rings somewhere in the darkness. And somehow, the departed always seem to hold a rather firm opinion on the matter. It was, by any reasonable measure, the least reliable jury in human history, and yet a great many perfectly respectable people wagered real fortunes on its verdicts. Spiritualism swept through both Britain and America with genuinely astonishing speed during the mid-19th century, sparked in significant part by two young sisters in New York State who claimed to communicate with the dead through mysterious rapping sounds heard in their family home. Almost overnight, it seemed, everyone wanted a turn at the table. Parlors across England filled with darkened rooms and joined hands, and the professional medium, a person claiming to sit at the very border between the living and the dead, passing messages back and forth across that boundary, became a genuine fixture of fashionable social life. In a century shadowed by early death, by lost infants and children, by vanished sailors and fevers capable of emptying a house within a single week, the longing to speak once more with the departed was powerful and very often painfully sincere. But grief was not the only motive drawing people to the séance table. Some attendees came with rather more practical questions in mind. They wanted the spirits to reveal the location of a hidden will, to name a suspected thief, to confirm a private suspicion, or to expose a lie that no living person seemed willing to admit to. The dead, after all, were widely imagined to see everything now, freed from the fog and limitation of the living flesh. Who, then, could possibly be better placed to judge the honesty of the living? The séance thus became a strange sort of informal tribunal, the medium serving as judge and the deceased serving as an all-seeing panel of witnesses who never had to face any real cross-examination. Picture the scene itself. The circle sits close together in near total darkness, palms flat against the table, forbidden from breaking physical contact with their neighbors. The medium's breathing shifts and deepens. A voice, not quite her own, begins to speak. The table shudders and tilts beneath their joined hands. A cold draft passes unexplained through the sealed room. A tambourine rattles somewhere it has no business rattling. And the answers arrive, always delivered with total confidence, always just vague enough to comfortably fit whatever the sitters had already hoped or quietly feared. Is he faithful? The spirits sigh out a gentle warning. Did she take the missing jewels? A single rap on the table would signal yes. It amounted, in practice, to a courtroom whose verdict very reliably flattered whoever happened to be paying for the sitting. And here the whole enterprise tended to collapse under even the lightest, most honest scrutiny. The effects that seemed so genuinely uncanny in the dark, the raps, the tilts, the floating trumpet, the ghostly touch on a sitter's shoulder turned out, again and again, to be precisely the sort of thing a clever operator could produce with a hidden foot, a practiced knee, a length of concealed thread, or an accomplice slipping quietly through a curtain. The darkness that supposedly summoned the spirits existed in reality mainly to hide the mechanics. The investigators of the dark here lies one of the genuinely delicious ironies of the era. The very same public that trusted spirits to expose the lies of the living soon found itself frantically trying to expose the mediums themselves as liars. A dedicated breed of investigator emerged to challenge the mediums at their own game. Some men of science, offended by claims that seemed to defy every known law of nature. Some professional stage conjurers, who recognized in the séance room the very tricks of their own trade being performed by a rival without any honesty about it being a show. And some simply grieving, swindled sitters who had paid real money and invested deep hope in speaking to a lost loved one, only to grow gradually suspicious that they had been thoroughly played. Their methods were genuinely ingenious, and they needed to be, since practiced mediums were skilled and séance rooms were carefully engineered to hide the mechanics of the performance. Investigators demanded control over the sitting itself, the right to choose the room, to physically bind the medium's hands and feet, to hold her fast throughout. They coated suspected objects in soot or fine flour, so that any supposedly ghostly manifestation would leave behind an entirely earthly smudge on a human hand. They concealed themselves beneath the séance table or behind curtains, and at the critical moment, as a spirit trumpet appeared to float, or a phantom face materialized, they struck a sudden light or lunged directly at the apparition, hopping to catch, in one shocking instant, the reaching human arm, the hidden accomplice, the length of blackened thread, or the mask fixed to the end of a stick. They often succeeded. Again and again, the marvels of the séance room were traced back to entirely human hands. A foot slipped free of a loosened shoe to produce the tilting and wrapping. A length of gauze arranged to resemble ghostly ectoplasm. An accomplice creeping through a concealed panel to play the part of the visiting spirit. The two American sisters whose mysterious rappings had helped ignite the entire spiritualist movement would, in time, confess that the sounds had been produced by the careful, practiced cracking of the joints in their own toes. A revelation that landed, for many believers, like a genuine thunderclap. Picture the precise moment of exposure. A lamp suddenly flaring to life in the middle of a sitting. The room lurching in an instant from reverent hush to full chaos. There, caught unmistakably in the light, sits the medium half risen from her chair, a spirit trumpet still gripped in her hand, a trailing scrap of ghostly cloth caught on her sleeve, her face frozen in the particular, unmistakable expression of a person caught in the very act of deception. What had felt, only a heartbeat earlier, like a genuine visitation from beyond, was suddenly revealed as a rather shabby piece of theater performed in the dark. And yet, remarkably, exposure rarely killed the underlying belief entirely. Devoted followers found ways to explain away individual instances of fraud, insisting that the true spirits remained real even if this particular medium happened to have cheated. And the séances, more often than not, simply carried on. Have you ever watched someone shown plain, undeniable proof of a trick, and yet refused to entirely let go of the wonder they'd felt? The will to believe, it turns out, proves considerably tougher than any single unmasking. The reading of the palm "Give me your hand," and no, in a Victorian parlor, this was not flirtation. This was investigation. Palmistry held that the creases running across your palm mapped out your underlying character, your fate, and quite possibly whether you were the sort of person inclined to tell a small fib before breakfast. A broken line here supposedly signaled a broken promise somewhere in your future. A particular curve was said to mark a person as a born deceiver. Your hand, which had spent the entire day doing nothing more dramatic than holding teacups and opening doors, might suddenly find itself read as a folded, private confession. Palmistry itself is considerably older than the Victorian era, but this particular century gave the practice a fresh coat of scientific-sounding respectability and attracted a genuinely devoted following. Its practitioners spoke with real authority of the major lines of the palm, the line of the heart, the line of the head, the line of life, and the line of fate, each supposedly tracing some deep and hidden current of a person's inner self. They studied the small fleshy pads at the base of each finger, known as the mounts, reading ambition, sensuality, or cunning into their relative fullness. A celebrated professional palmist working under the stage name Chero drew fashionable London drawing rooms into a genuine frenzy, reading hands with such confident flair that even prominent and powerful people lined up to offer him their palms for inspection. For anyone hunting specifically for signs of dishonesty, the palm held particular promise. Certain lines were said to reveal a slippery, false nature, small chains, tiny islands within a line, faint crosses that supposedly betrayed a talent for deceit or an unreliable character. A palmist determined to assess your honesty would trace these features slowly, murmuring to himself as he built up a full portrait of your soul from the simple folds in your skin. He examined whether your fingers ran smooth or visibly knotted, whether your thumb bent easily backward, whether your palm felt firm or notably soft. And from all of this, he would pronounce, with total confidence, on whether or not you could ultimately be trusted. Picture surrendering your hand to such an examination. He turns it gently toward the lamplight, smooths the palm flat beneath his thumb, and begins. This particular break in your heart line, he notes gravely, speaks of a deceitful streak where love is concerned. This small island on your headline suggests a mind inclined to twist the truth. This faint cross here, a warning of a false friend nearby, or perhaps of a false nature within yourself. You have offered nothing more than an ordinary hand that has spent its whole life doing entirely ordinary things, and it is being read aloud as though it were a ledger of your private sins. And of course, the lines themselves meant nothing of the kind. The creases in a person's palm are shaped by how the hand folds and grips over the course of a lifetime, by simple heredity, by ordinary use, not by the current state of anyone's conscience. A genuine liar and a genuine saint might easily share the very same broken line. Where palmistry appeared to work, it worked chiefly through the practitioner's own shrewd reading of the person attached to the hand, their clothing, their manner, their small nervous reactions. With those observations then quietly draped over the palm lines as though the skin itself had confessed them. There was real warmth in it too, admittedly. A pleasant intimacy in having one's hand held and one's future gently forecast, and much of palmistry was offered in exactly that light, entertaining spirit. But turned deliberately into a test of honesty, it became something considerably colder, a means of convicting a person of dishonesty based purely on the accident of their own creases. The racing thought calm voice reads you a single word and asks you to respond instantly with the very first word that leaps into your mind. Bread, knife, money. This particular test came once again from the restless mind of Francis Galton, this time poking at the inner machinery of the mind itself, to see what tumbled loose before a person had the chance to tidy it up. The underlying idea was that a guilty thought hides just behind an ordinary, polite one, and that if the words come quickly enough, the examiner might catch that guilty thought sprinting for the exit before it could be properly concealed. Galton was genuinely fascinated by how the mind linked one idea to the next, by how a single spoken word might drag an entire chain of memories and buried feelings up from somewhere beneath conscious awareness. He tried the experiment first on himself, sitting quietly and carefully, noting the very first thought each individual word summoned, timing precisely how long each response took to arrive. What he found, by his own account, unsettled him somewhat. The words dragged up old memories, private associations, buried feelings he had never intended to disturb. He had, quite by accident, stumbled onto a kind of side door into the mind, one that opened before the careful, editing part of the self could rush over and slam it firmly shut. From this observation came the tempting notion that truth hunters of the era found genuinely irresistible. Fire a rapid series of ordinary words at a subject, the reasoning went, and the mind will answer honestly before it has had time to construct a convenient lie. Slip a dangerous word into the middle of that list, a word touching directly on the crime, on the victim, on the hidden secret, and watch closely for what happens next. Does the subject hesitate for just a beat too long? Does an odd, revealing word leap unbidden from their mouth, a word clearly connected to the very thing they are trying desperately to conceal? Does their steady, practiced rhythm suddenly stumble? In exactly that flicker of hesitation, the truth hunter believed the guilty mind gave itself away. Imagine sitting across from an examiner as the ordinary words come steadily and quickly. House, you answer door. River, you answer boat. Then, dropped in among the harmless words, comes one that touches directly on the missing money, and your mind, startled, hesitates, or worse, throws up exactly the word you had been desperately trying not to think of at all. The pause hangs heavily in the air. The examiner writes something down without a word. You have said nothing outright and incriminating, and yet the small hitch in your answer feels somehow louder than any spoken confession could have been. And here the method, for all its genuine cleverness, tangled itself into a familiar knot. A guilty word or a telling pause could certainly mean a hidden crime, true enough. But it could just as easily mean that a perfectly innocent person had simply heard a heavy, loaded word, felt the weight of sudden suspicion pressing down on them, and frozen exactly as any frightened, honest soul reasonably would. The mind stumbles for 1,000 different reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with guilt: a random unrelated memory, a moment's simple distraction, the sheer accumulated strain of being tested at all. The examiner, naturally, saw only the stumble itself, never the entirely harmless reason lying quietly behind it. Still, there was something genuinely ahead of its time buried in this particular experiment. Galton had, almost by accident, opened a real path toward the later scientific study of the unconscious mind, toward the broader idea that thoughts move constantly below the surface of conscious awareness, betraying themselves in small, measurable delays. Later researchers would seize on exactly this insight, timing responses with increasingly careful instruments, hunting for guilt in the precise length of a hesitation. The damp hand: try to keep your palms dry. Go on, try. Victorian truth hunters were genuinely convinced that a liar sweats, that guilt seeps out through the skin much as steam escapes a boiling kettle. A clammy handshake, a damp brow, a palm pressed flat and slick against a table. All of it was read as the body confessing precisely what the mouth refused to admit. It made little difference that you might be sweating simply because the room was warm, your collar too tight, and 40 pairs of eyes were fixed directly on your hands. The moisture, in the Victorian view, spoke for itself, and what it said was guilty. This particular belief was genuinely ancient, considerably older than the Victorians, who inherited it from much older traditions holding that a liar's mouth ran dry while a liar's hands ran wet. Somewhere in the distant past, examiners were said to have made a suspect chew dry rice, or hold a piece of heated metal, reasoning that fear stopped the flow of saliva and thickened the tongue, so that an innocent person, calm and naturally moist-mouthed, could swallow the rice easily, while a genuinely guilty person, parched with terror, could not. The Victorians, with their particular taste for closely observing the body, simply carried this ancient instinct forward and turned their attention toward the hands, the brow, and the upper lip. Anywhere, in short, that a nervous sheen might betray a soul supposedly under strain. There is, it must be said, a real kernel of genuine truth buried in all this, which is precisely what made the belief so remarkably stubborn and hard to dislodge. Fear genuinely does change the body in measurable ways. When a person feels frightened, the heart pounds harder, the breath quickens, and yes, the palms do tend to grow damp, part of a very ancient physiological alarm system that prepares a creature either to fight or to flee. The Victorian truth hunters had, in a sense, noticed something entirely real. Their error lay not in observing the sweat itself, but in assuming they knew precisely why it had appeared, in leaping directly from "the body is afraid" to "the body is guilty," as though the two conditions had ever been reliably the same thing. Picture the handshake exchanged at a doorway, that small, ordinary social ritual quietly weaponized into an informal test. A man takes your hand, holds it perhaps a beat longer than feels entirely natural, and feels for any telltale moisture. A damp palm, and his eyes narrow slightly. He has decided, he believes, something genuinely true about your underlying character before either of you has exchanged a single meaningful word. Or picture, instead, a formal questioning, where an examiner watches a sheen gather slowly across your forehead, watches a bead of sweat form above your upper lip, and treats each glistening drop as a small, involuntary admission wrung from your unwilling body. And of course, this particular test convicted the innocent every bit as readily as the guilty, perhaps considerably more readily. For who sweats most freely under this kind of pressure? Not always the actual wrongdoer, but very often the shy, the anxious, the person genuinely terrified of being falsely blamed for something they had no part in, the honest soul who has never once been formally accused of anything in their life, and who finds the entire ordeal of suspicion nearly unbearable. Their hands grow slick with pure, undiluted dread, and that dread is promptly read as proof of a crime they never committed. Meanwhile, the cool, practiced liar, entirely untroubled by any genuine pang of conscience, keeps his palms as dry as a summer road. The room itself, in a very real sense, conspired against the innocent. A warm, crowded parlor, a heavy winter coat, a stiff formal collar, the accumulated body heat of many people pressed closely together. All of it drew out sweat regardless of anyone's actual guilt or innocence. And the very knowledge that one is being closely watched specifically for sweat is, if anything, the surest possible way to summon it, since nothing makes the palms grow damp faster than the desperate, self-conscious wish that they would remain perfectly dry. So you would press your palms flat against the table and pray, silently, that they would betray nothing at all, feeling the treacherous warmth gather regardless. The moisture rises. A knowing glance passes between the observers across the room, and you learn, yet again, the old, deeply unfair lesson of this particular century, that in an age thoroughly convinced the body could never keep a secret, even entirely honest fear could be read aloud as a confession you never actually made. The tattling tongue open wide, please, and say, ah, because your physician in this particular century firmly believes your tongue has rather a great deal to say about your character, and not only your health. In an era where medicine blended real, careful observation with a considerable amount of confident guesswork, doctors routinely inspected the tongue, the complexion, and the whites of the eyes for signs of hidden vice, secret illness, or quiet moral decline. A pale tongue, a yellowish tint to the eye, a certain grayness of the skin, each was folded, quite seamlessly, into a diagnosis of a person's character as readily as into a diagnosis of their physical health. You might arrive at the surgery complaining of an ordinary cough and leave, rather unexpectedly, with a fresh reputation. Victorian medicine occupied a genuinely strange middle ground, part real, careful science steadily creeping toward the modern world we would recognize today, and part older, inherited belief that had not yet been fully swept away by that progress. The physicians of this era were often marvelous, patient observers, carefully trained to read the outward surface of the body for genuine clues, and a great deal of what they noticed was entirely real and clinically useful. The tongue genuinely can hint at underlying illness, coated in the presence of fever, unusually pale during periods of exhaustion, and a skilled physician of the time could learn a great deal from a careful, attentive look. But running alongside this real clinical skill was an older, harder-to-shake habit, the conviction that the body's outward signs revealed not merely sickness, but the entire moral condition of a person, their habits, their private appetites, their very soul. So the ordinary medical examination frequently became something considerably broader than medicine alone. The physician would peer at your tongue and read into it not merely your digestion, but your general discipline, judging silently whether you drank to excess, indulged too freely in rich food, lived a clean and orderly life, or a more dissolute one. He studied your complexion for any flush that might indicate secret vice, any pallor that might speak of hidden sin. He examined the whites of your eyes for a particular yellow tint he believed indicated a body slowly poisoned by improper living. Illness and immorality blurred together rather thoroughly in this framework, until a simple physical symptom could become a kind of character reference, and a genuinely sick person found themselves quietly suspected of having brought their own suffering upon themselves through some private fault they would rather keep hidden. Picture yourself under this particular gaze. You have come to the surgery about a persistent cough, or a nagging pain, or a general weariness you cannot quite shake off. The physician tilts your chin gently toward the window light, examines your tongue with a slight frown, presses 2 fingers beneath your eyes, and hums thoughtfully to himself. Then, in the careful, measured voice of a man delivering a considered verdict, he begins to speak not only of your physical health, but of your habits, hinting that your complexion suggests a degree of intemperance, that your tongue betrays a certain want of self-control, that your overall constitution shows the marks of a life not quite lived as it perhaps should have been. You leave feeling read, judged, and quietly filed away among the weak or the wayward. And here this particular blending of medicine and morality caused genuine, tangible harm. A person's illness was frequently treated as evidence of a lie, of some secret private indulgence they must surely be concealing, so that the sick were made to feel guilty on top of being simply unwell. Diseases that sprang, in reality, from poverty, from overcrowded rooms, thin and inadequate food, brutal physical labor, were instead read as the body's own confession of private vice. It was rather like being personally blamed for the weather simply because you happened to be caught outside in the rain. There is, to be entirely fair, a genuinely valuable thread running through all of this. The real, promising beginnings of a medicine that could truly read the body's outward signs in service of healing it. But tangled through that valuable thread ran the older, moralizing instinct, the persistent refusal to let a symptom simply be a symptom, the deep need to turn every pallor and every coated tongue into a small, private accusation. The listening instrument, the stethoscope, was new, genuinely wondrous, and now pressed firmly against your chest, so that a very solemn physician might listen closely to your heart quietly panicking. If your pulse quickened noticeably at some particularly pointed question, well, your heart, apparently, had spoken plainly, and it had rather clearly betrayed you. It did not seem to occur to very many people that your heart might simply be racing, because a stranger was pressing cold wood firmly against your ribs while frowning gravely and accusing you of something. In this particular century, every involuntary thump of the heart was treated as sworn testimony you had never actually intended to give. The instrument itself represented a genuine medical marvel, invented somewhat earlier by a French physician named René Laennec, who is said to have grown uncomfortable with the established practice of pressing his ear directly against a female patient's chest, and instead rolled a simple tube of paper into a makeshift listening device. That improvised paper tube gradually developed into the modern stethoscope, and it genuinely transformed the practice of medicine, allowing a physician, for the first time in history, to listen directly to the hidden inner workings of the body, the steady beat of the heart, the rush of the breath, the faint crackle of a diseased lung. It was, without exaggeration, one of the real triumphs of the age, letting a doctor hear truths the eye alone could never possibly have reached. But an instrument capable of hearing the heart was soon imagined by some to be capable of hearing considerably more than it reasonably should. If the heart quickened noticeably with fear, the truth hunters of the era reasoned, and if fear rose predictably in a genuinely guilty person under close questioning, then perhaps a doctor with a stethoscope pressed against a subject's chest might just manage to hear a lie the very moment it was told. Ask the dangerous question. Listen closely to the sudden gallop of the pulse, and there, in that racing rhythm, surely lay the confession the mouth itself had steadfastly withheld. The wondrous new medical instrument, designed and intended purely for healing, found itself quietly recruited into the era's endless, restless hunt for deceit. Picture the cold metal disc pressed against your bare chest, the examiner leaning in close, his eyes distant with concentration as he listens carefully. He asks you softly where you were on a particular evening, whether you knew a certain man, whether you had taken the item that had gone missing, and your heart, quite naturally, leaps in response. Not because you are guilty of anything, but because a stranger is listening intently to the inside of your own body while simultaneously accusing you of a crime. The gallop he hears through his instrument is entirely real. The meaning he assigns to it is entirely invented. He has heard your fear and quietly chosen to call it your guilt instead. And that, in the end, is the whole essential trouble with listening to the heart in search of honesty. The heart is loyal only to raw feeling, never to plain truth, and it pounds just as readily at any kind of fear, the fear of being genuinely caught, and the fear of being wrongly blamed sounding, through a simple wooden tube, entirely identical either way. There is a real irony sitting quietly at the center of all this. The stethoscope itself belonged firmly to the future, to a steadily maturing medicine growing more careful, more precise, and increasingly capable of hearing the genuine signs of genuine disease. And yet the era's truth hunters dragged this fine, forward-looking instrument backward into service of a considerably older superstition. The stubborn belief that a frightened body must somehow also be a guilty one. The suspected malingerer now imagined for a moment that you were attempting to lie in precisely the opposite direction, pretending to be genuinely ill in order to escape onerous labor, the harsh conditions of the workhouse, or compulsory military service. Bad news awaited you here as well. The Victorians maintained an entire dedicated cottage industry devoted to catching out the malingerer, the faker, the fellow suspected by an examining physician of being altogether too clever by half. Doctors of the era devised a whole range of small, deliberately cruel tests, sudden unexpected pricks with a pin, surprise commands barked without warning, carefully arranged little traps designed specifically to make a false invalid flinch and inadvertently give the entire game away. Faking a convincing limp sounded like a fairly simple matter. Right up until a physician began circling you slowly, holding a pin, watching intently for the smallest slip. The figure of the malinger loomed rather large in the anxieties of the era, precisely because there were so many genuinely hard circumstances a person might reasonably wish to escape. There was the army, with its notoriously brutal discipline and its distant, dangerous wars, and a soldier who could successfully convince an examining surgeon that he was medically unfit might well save his own life in the process. There was the factory floor and the coal mine, where a worker claiming to be too badly injured to continue might hope to claim some measure of ongoing relief. There was the workhouse itself, and the various pension boards of the era, where a sufficiently convincing display of infirmity could mean the difference between bread and genuine hunger. And so, wherever genuine suffering might reasonably be traded for a measure of mercy, someone, somewhere, stood suspected of counterfeiting that very suffering, and someone else was paid a wage specifically to catch them at it. The physicians assigned this particular task developed a whole grim, systematic art of exposure. A man might claim his arm was entirely paralyzed, and the examining physician would wait patiently until the man's attention was elsewhere, then suddenly let the man's own arm drop sharply toward his own unguarded face, watching closely to see whether an instinctive flinch saved him at the last moment, since a truly paralyzed arm, of course, would offer no such last-second protection. A man might claim total numbness in a particular limb, and the doctor would prick it sharply without warning, hunting carefully for any small, involuntary twitch that might betray genuine sensation still present beneath the surface. A man claiming blindness might be subjected to a series of clever visual tests, specifically designed to trick a genuinely seeing eye into unconsciously revealing itself. A man claiming to suffer from fits might be closely observed to see whether he fell, when the seizure supposedly struck, onto something conveniently soft, as a practiced faker might arrange in advance, or crash down entirely heedless of his own safety, as a person genuinely stricken tends to do. Picture yourself, then, as the subject of this particular kind of scrutiny, whether you happen to be genuinely suffering or desperately pretending out of real and pressing desperation. If you are genuinely ill, you must somehow find a way to convince a fundamentally doubting stranger that your torment is entirely real, all while knowing that genuine illness, by its very nature, cannot always argue its own case with perfect clarity or consistency. If you are, in fact, feigning your symptoms, you must sustain a convincing performance under the close, trained gaze of an examiner who has already personally caught 100 fakers before you, never quite knowing which of his gentle, apparently casual questions might conceal the real trap. And if you happen to be entirely sane and healthy but wrongly accused of malingering, you face perhaps the cruelest task of all, attempting to prove your own basic soundness of body to a man already inclined to disbelieve you, when your very protest against the accusation might itself be read as a further symptom of deception. And yet, for all the examining doctor's genuine cunning, this particular hunt reliably caught the innocent alongside the truly guilty, and cruelly so. The genuinely sick and the genuinely injured, those whose suffering was entirely real, were forced to submit to precisely the same suspicious battery of pricks, traps, and cold interrogations, treated essentially as liars until they could somehow manage to prove their own pain beyond reasonable doubt. A genuinely ill person, frightened and in real physical agony, might react in some unexpected way to a sudden pin prick, might tell their own story slightly differently on a second telling, simply out of sheer exhaustion, and find their entirely honest suffering read, unfairly, as a clumsy performance. The witness box. Should you ever find yourself standing in a Victorian courtroom, prepare yourself for the performance of your entire life. The witness box functioned, in a very real sense, as a small stage, one on which your innocence had to be convincingly acted out, because the assembled jury was reading your every small twitch and hesitation. Speak too smoothly and confidently, and you were judged rehearsed. Stumble over your words even slightly, and you were judged evasive. Weep, and you were judged manipulative. Remain entirely composed, and you were judged coldly guilty. The law claimed, of course, to weigh only the actual evidence presented, but in that crowded, wood-paneled room, a great many people were quietly deciding, in parallel, whether you simply looked like the honest sort of person, whatever exactly that vague impression was meant to mean in practice. The Victorian courtroom was a genuine place of high ceremony and correspondingly high stakes, and it took the pursuit of truth with real seriousness, or at least sincerely believed that it did. There were formal rules of evidence, sworn oaths administered with real solemnity, sharp and well-trained barristers whose entire professional skill lay in picking apart a witness's story word by careful word. But beneath all of this solemn legal machinery sat an older, considerably cruder instinct, the very same one loose in every Victorian parlor and lurking on every suspicious doorstep, that a person's fundamental honesty could be reliably read directly off their outward manner. The jury, after all, was simply made up of ordinary men, and they judged as ordinary men naturally do, weighing not only the literal content of what a witness said, but how that witness appeared while saying it, whether they seemed to belong to the respectable, trustworthy sort, or whether something about their bearing simply sat wrong. So the witness box effectively became a stage, and you, its reluctant performer, were forced to act out the part of your own genuine innocence before an audience that had, in all likelihood, already begun forming its opinions before you had said a single word. The barrister representing the opposing side functioned as a kind of hostile theater critic, watching keenly for any false note he might seize upon and dramatically magnify before the jury. Answer a question too quickly, and he would suggest you had your convenient story prepared well in advance. Answer too slowly, and he would suggest you were inventing your account on the spot, right there in front of everyone. Meet his eye directly, and you were brazen. Look away, even briefly, and you were furtive. Every possible path available to you concealed some kind of trap, and he, as a trained professional, knew this particular terrain a great deal better than you ever could. Picture the full ordeal. You gripped the wooden rail of the box, acutely aware of the judge seated above you, the jury arranged to one side, the crowded public gallery leaning forward with obvious interest, every single face in the room turned toward you, reading you. Your voice emerges rather thinner than you had intended. Your hands refuse to remain still. You try consciously to appear calm, and manage only to appear stiff and unnatural instead. You feel a single bead of sweat forming, a small catch rising in your throat, an unwelcome heat spreading across your cheeks, and you understand with a sinking sense of horror that all of the era's old familiar tests are effectively being run on you simultaneously. The blush, the gaze, the sweat, the tremor, and that not one of them, individually or together, can actually distinguish your entirely innocent fear from genuine guilt. That, in the end, is the deep and abiding unfairness woven through the entire performance. Innocence and simple terror very often wear precisely the same outward face. An honest man wrongly accused of something is frequently frightened half out of his wits by the accusation itself, and his fear quite naturally makes him stammer, sweat, and instinctively avoid the many pitiless eyes fixed upon him. All of which the jury has been carefully taught, by an entire century's worth of confident bad theory, to read as the unmistakable marks of a practiced liar. Meanwhile, the truly skilled deceiver, calm, well-dressed, and perfectly steady of gaze, delivers precisely the smooth, convincing performance that the watching room has been quietly longing to believe all along. Outward manner, in the end, is simply not the same thing as honesty. A perfectly smooth, composed witness may in fact be a genuine scoundrel, and a visibly trembling one may in fact be an entirely honest soul. And yet the witness box, again and again, reliably rewarded the smooth performer and punished the trembling one. The sworn oath: place your hand firmly upon the Bible, and swear to tell the truth, and truly mean it, because a great many people in this era sincerely believed that the Almighty Himself would strike down a deliberate liar on the very spot. The formal oath was treated, in effect, as a kind of lie detector powered entirely by the deep fear of eternal consequences. The underlying reasoning was straightforward enough. A man might reasonably lie to a mere earthly judge, but surely no one would dare to lie directly to God Himself, with an entire courtroom looking on as witness. In practice, this particular test worked reasonably well only on the honest people who had never actually needed it in the first place. The formal oath ranks among the oldest truth tests known to any human society, and the Victorians took it with real, considered seriousness. To swear upon the Bible was, in effect, to call God Himself forward as a personal witness, staking not merely one's earthly reputation, but one's immortal soul on the literal truth of one's own words. In an age of powerful, widely shared religious faith, where the reality of hell was preached from countless pulpits as a vivid and burning certainty, this was understood to be no small matter whatsoever. The underlying idea was that the fear of eternal damnation would succeed precisely where every other social pressure had failed, that a person who might reasonably think to cheat an earthly court would never quite dare to cheat heaven itself, and that the sheer solemn weight of a properly sworn oath would squeeze genuine truth even out of an otherwise hardened liar. The entire formal legal machinery of the period leaned rather heavily on this underlying belief. Testimony was trusted specifically because it had been sworn under oath. Contracts were honored in significant part because solemn oaths had been formally taken in connection with them. A person's given word, once pledged before God, was treated as bound by a force considerably stronger than any merely earthly law could provide. So central was this particular belief that those who could not, or sincerely would not, swear an oath in the customary manner, whether because their personal religious beliefs differed, or because they held no religious belief at all, were regarded with genuine, deep suspicion, and were in some cases barred entirely from giving formal testimony, as though an unsworn word could somehow carry no truth within it whatsoever. Picture the actual moment itself. The court clerk holds out the worn, well-handled book. You lay your hand upon its cover and repeat the solemn, formal words, promising before God to speak nothing but the plain truth. A hush settles over the room. Everyone present watches closely to see precisely how you say it, whether your voice remains steady, whether you appear to genuinely feel the true weight of what you are doing, whether you seem, in short, to be the sort of person the oath still meaningfully binds. In that particular instant, you are meant to feel the watching eyes of heaven itself resting upon you, and to understand clearly that a lie told now would represent not merely an earthly crime, but a genuine sin destined to follow you well beyond the grave. And here, the considerable flaw at the heart of the sworn oath reveals itself plainly enough. The oath worked reliably only on the person who already sincerely believed in it, and who already fully intended to tell the truth regardless. For the honest and genuinely faithful, it simply added a further layer of solemn weight to a promise they would very likely have kept in any case. But for the truly determined liar, precisely the person this particular test most urgently needed to catch, the oath amounted to nothing more than a set of words to be recited with a perfectly straight face before proceeding directly with the intended deception. A man genuinely willing to lie in order to ruin another person was hardly likely to be meaningfully deterred by a formal phrase recited from an old book. The oath, in the end, effectively bound exactly those people who needed no binding whatsoever, and slid harmlessly off exactly those who did. The servants below stairs downstairs. This same broad war on lying became considerably more personal and considerably more grinding. If you happen to work as a maid, a footman, or a cook within a grand Victorian household, you lived under a standing presumption of guilt, simply waiting to be proven merely poor rather than actively dishonest. A missing spoon, a curiously short measure of sugar, a whispered rumor carried up the back stairs, and quite suddenly your entire personal character found itself effectively on trial within the drawing room above. Employers studied your face closely for the faintest telltale sign of theft, demanded written references that read very much like formal verdicts, and generally treated basic honesty as something the domestic servant classes were perpetually required to prove anew. Trust, in this particular household arrangement, did not readily travel downstairs. The typical Victorian household of any real size ran on the labor of servants, sometimes whole small armies of them, in the grander establishments, and the relationship between those above stairs and those below was thoroughly soaked in a kind of persistent mutual suspicion. The people responsible for keeping the household fires lit, the meals properly cooked, the family silver polished, and the children fed were also, almost by definition, the people most closely and constantly watched. For they lived in close daily intimacy with the family's possessions and private household affairs, while remaining, in the family's own eyes, forever slightly untrustworthy by default. To work as a servant was to be granted deep, genuine intimacy with an entire household's private life, and yet never to be quite fully trusted by it, to handle nearly everything a family owned, while simultaneously being suspected of secretly coveting a portion of it. The informal tests of servant honesty employed in these households were genuinely endless, genuinely small, and genuinely grinding in their steady accumulation. A careful mistress of the house would routinely count the household spoons, weigh out the sugar with real precision, mark the measured level remaining in the wine decanter, and keep a private, ongoing tally of the household linens. All in an effort to catch whatever pilfering she remained privately convinced must surely be occurring somewhere in her house. She might set small, deliberate traps, a coin left conspicuously where it ought not to be, simply to observe whether it quietly vanished or was dutifully returned untouched. She would listen carefully to gossip passed between neighboring households, since a servant's personal reputation tended to travel well ahead of them on a steady tide of whispered conversation. And above all else stood the formal character, the written reference from a previous employer, without which a servant could scarcely hope to find fresh employment at all, a single sheet of paper capable, entirely on its own, of either lifting a person into a genuinely good position or condemning them instead to real destitution. Picture your own position within this particular arrangement. You rise well before dawn each morning and labor steadily until long after darkness has fallen, and through every single hour of that long working day, you remain watched, your pockets treated as inherently suspect, your face read for any sign of guilt, your smallest ordinary action carefully weighed. Some small trinket goes missing somewhere within the house, and every eye in the household turns immediately toward you and your fellow servants below stairs, even though 100 perfectly innocent explanations might easily account for its disappearance. You find yourself questioned directly. Your small room is perhaps searched without warning. Your outward manner is studied closely for whatever telltale signs the era firmly believed in: the sudden blush, the shifting gaze, the visibly nervous hand. You have, in fact, taken nothing at all. It scarcely matters. Suspicion, in this particular household, falls downward as naturally and inevitably as water finds its own level. And the real cruelty of the arrangement lay in just how little genuine defense was available to you. A servant formally accused of theft had essentially no real standing to argue the matter on equal terms, no meaningful way to demand fair proof before judgment was rendered. An employer's simple word reliably outweighed a servant's own testimony many times over. To protest one's innocence too vigorously was itself read as a further sign of guilt. To remain quiet and simply endure the accusation was read as guilt in equal measure. And should you ultimately lose your formal character, that precious written reference, over a theft you had genuinely never committed, you might well find every respectable door in the entire city closed firmly against you. Cast out not because your guilt had ever actually been proven, but merely because it had been sufficiently suspected by someone with the social standing to make that suspicion count. The trial of the heart. Now we arrive at what was perhaps the most exhausting court of all, the human heart itself. In a world governed by arranged matches, discreetly secret engagements, and letters carefully sealed with wax, everyone involved was genuinely desperate to know whether the particular object of their affection was being entirely truthful with them. Suitors found themselves investigated very much like criminal suspects. Love letters were pored over at length for any hidden meaning they might contain. A blush, a lingering glance, a slightly delayed reply, each one became a small piece of evidence in the ongoing, essentially endless trial of whether a suitor actually meant what he claimed to feel. You may think modern dating carries its own particular exhaustion. Try Victorian courtship instead, where an entire watchful family sat, quite literally, as a permanent standing jury. Victorian courtship followed a strange and highly formal dance, hedged about on every side with careful social rules, and closely watched by essentially everyone involved. A young man and woman were rarely, if ever, left genuinely alone together, and their gradually growing mutual affection had to be conducted almost entirely through carefully chaperoned visits, through dances measured out precisely on a printed dance card, and above all through personal letters, those precious folded pages carrying real feeling across whatever physical distance happened to separate two people. In a world where so very much could not be openly said aloud in mixed company, the private letter became the primary vessel of the heart. And the human heart, being exactly what it is, could never be entirely sure that this particular vessel was carrying the plain truth. Marriage in this era represented, of course, a great deal more than simple romantic love. It involved money, land, family standing, and future prospects, and wherever significant fortunes were genuinely at stake, practiced deceivers tended to gather. A genuinely charming suitor might, in reality, be nothing more than a calculating fortune hunter, courting a woman's purse rather than her person. A warmly tender letter might amount to pure calculated performance, its affectionate phrases lifted more or less directly from one of the era's actual published manuals of model love letters. Books that genuinely existed on the market, sold specifically to assist the tongue-tied, and inevitably also assisting the deliberately insincere. A young woman found herself forced to ask whether a suitor's ardor was genuinely real or carefully calculated, whether the man kneeling formally before her truly wanted her heart, or merely her family's inheritance, and she had only his outward manner and his chosen words to judge the matter by. So the era's whole extensive apparatus of suspicion turned inward, applied now to the tender and genuinely terrifying question of whether someone truly loved you. The letter itself was studied like a formal piece of legal evidence, read and carefully reread, its individual phrases weighed for sincerity, its very handwriting sometimes handed directly to a professional graphologist for a formal assessment of the writer's true underlying character. A blush was watched for closely. A glance was mentally timed. A delay in replying to a letter was interpreted either as cooling affection or as evidence of a guilty conscience. Entire families launched quiet, discreet investigations into a prospective suitor's actual finances and personal reputation, sending out careful private inquiries in much the same manner a formal court might summon its own witnesses. The whole extensive machinery of Victorian suspicion, originally built to catch thieves and hardened criminals, found itself pointed now at the profoundly tender question of genuine love. And here, naturally enough, the old familiar tests failed exactly as they always did. For love wears precisely the same outward signs, whether it happens to be genuinely sincere or entirely false. The truly sincere suitor blushes and stammers from the sheer honest force of his own feeling, and is promptly suspected of hiding something. The insincere one, practiced and entirely cool, delivers his romantic lines flawlessly, and is readily believed. Have you ever agonized privately over whether someone truly meant what they had said to you, and found that no amount of careful study of their exact words could ever quite settle the underlying question? In the end, the human heart cannot be reliably measured, blushed at, or read like ordinary handwriting on a page. The camera that could not lie photography stood as the great miracle invention of the age, and a great many people had quietly decided that it simply could not deceive. The camera, they said, captured the plain truth of a face in a way no painter working by hand ever could. Criminals were photographed for the permanent police record. The guilty were pinned neatly to small identification cards. And some people sincerely believed that a properly positioned camera lens might even catch a departed spirit hovering faintly just behind the shoulder of the living. Of course, that very same marvelous new technology was simultaneously being used to fake ghosts and stage convincing lies through carefully arranged double exposures. The camera, it turned out, never lied except, of course, for the many times it very much did. When photography first arrived on the scene, it genuinely felt like magic made real. Here, at last, was a way to fix the truth of a single passing moment permanently and exactly, beyond any real argument. A skilled painter might flatter a sitter, or simply forget certain unflattering details entirely, but the camera, people widely believed, merely recorded whatever was genuinely there before it, honest, mechanical, and fundamentally beyond the reach of deceit. This deep faith shaped how the era chose to use its wondrous new invention. Police forces began systematically photographing convicted criminals, building up extensive albums of individual faces, the so-called rogues galleries, so that a known wrongdoer might be recognized again, and never managed to hide successfully behind a freshly invented false name. A photograph felt, in a real sense, like proof itself, a small fragment of frozen reality that no convenient lie could easily touch. The era's truth hunters naturally seized on this new tool with real enthusiasm. If the camera genuinely captured a person's true face, then surely, the reasoning went, it also captured whatever true character happened to be stamped upon that same face. And the old, familiar dreams of physiognomy and Lombroso's criminal types were given a fresh new lease on life through this powerful modern tool. Faces were photographed extensively, studied closely, sorted and compared in the ongoing, essentially endless hope of finally catching wickedness itself within a clear, unarguable image. A photograph of a convicted criminal came to be treated not merely as a simple record of who that person happened to be, but as genuine evidence of what they fundamentally were, their guilt, somehow permanently fixed in silver alongside their ordinary human features. But here the era's great collective faith curdled rather quickly into fine, unintentional comedy. The very same camera trusted never to lie turned out to be a wonderfully gifted liar in its own right. Clever, enterprising photographers quickly learned the medium's available tricks. By exposing a single photographic plate twice in sequence, they could make a pale, faintly transparent figure appear to hover directly beside an entirely living sitter. And from this simple technique was born the genuinely roaring trade in so-called spirit photography. formal portraits in which the dead appeared, quite convincingly, to stand ghostly and watchful behind their grieving living relatives. Desperate, sorrowful mourners paid real, often substantial money for these carefully staged images, weeping openly over the faint, painted in faces of lost loved ones, never once suspecting that they were gazing at nothing more than a clever second exposure and a photographer's entirely cold, calculating cunning. Picture a grieving widow clutching one of these photographs, entirely certain that a camera universally understood never to lie had somehow given her back a genuine glimpse of her departed husband. The very faith that made the image so deeply precious to her was precisely the same faith that made the resulting fraud so genuinely cruel, since she trusted the camera lens exactly because everyone around her had assured her, repeatedly, that it simply could not deceive. And so an instrument widely hailed as the great and honest truth-teller became, in the wrong hands, the perfect quiet engine of a genuinely heartless lie. The deeper lesson sitting plainly available for anyone willing to actually see it was this. The camera itself captures neither truth nor lies. It captures only light, arranged carefully by whoever happens to be holding it, and it will just as readily frame a deliberate fraud as an honest fact. A photograph can be posed, staged, deliberately doubled, and carefully doctored, and the most convincingly honest-looking image may, in fact, represent the deepest deception of all. The forger's careful hand as paper money, formal contracts, and personal signatures increasingly came to govern the modern financial world. The forger emerged as a genuinely feared and reviled villain of the age, and the careful detection of forgery developed into a fine and genuinely profitable professional art. Trained experts hunted patiently for the small trembling hand hiding behind an otherwise convincing copied signature, for the tiny telltale pauses embedded within a single pen stroke, for ink that sat just a shade too fresh upon an otherwise old page. A forged name amounted, in effect, to a lie made permanent and durable, and successfully unmasking one could save an entire family fortune, or alternatively, quietly ruin one. Somewhere in a dimly lit room, a genuinely nervous man was carefully practicing another man's signature by candlelight, sincerely praying that no one would ever look too closely at the result. The Victorian world increasingly ran on paper, and correspondingly on trust in exactly what that paper claimed to represent. A banknote promised, on its face, to pay a stated sum. A formal contract legally bound its signers. A will divided an entire family fortune according to its written terms. A signature sealed a bargain and stood, symbolically, for the very person who had made it. In such a world, the forger represented a particularly dangerous kind of thief, one who stole not merely a purse or a piece of jewelry, but a person's own hand, their name, their formal authority, their given word. A forged signature amounted to a lie set down permanently in ink, a false promise wearing convincingly the face of a genuinely true one, and its power to cause real ruin was considerable, capable of emptying an entire bank account, seizing a family estate, or toppling a household's fortunes in a single stroke of a borrowed name. Against the forger rose a genuinely new breed of dedicated truth hunter, the examiner of questioned documents, and their particular art was, refreshingly, both careful and often genuinely clever. They studied a disputed signature carefully alongside known genuine examples, hunting patiently for the small, involuntary betrayals that no forger, however skilled, could entirely avoid leaving behind. Here lay the forger's essential curse. To successfully copy another person's distinctive hand, he had to draw it slowly and carefully, watching every individual line as he worked, and this very carefulness left its own unmistakable mark. A genuine signature is typically written swiftly and without conscious thought, flowing naturally and with real confidence. A forged one, by contrast, is necessarily built up line by careful line, and under close examination it tends to reveal the trembling hesitation of the copyist, the tiny pauses where the pen briefly stopped, an unnatural evenness of pressure, small unnatural lifts, and touches that a genuine, careless hand would simply never produce. The trained examiners brought genuinely useful tools to this particular hunt, magnifying glasses to enlarge each individual stroke for close study. Careful attention paid to the exact quality of the ink and paper involved, and a steadily growing body of practical knowledge concerning precisely how a truly authentic hand tended to differ from a carefully forged one. They learned to recognize the small points where a forger had lifted his pen briefly to check against his model, where a line wavered slightly under conscious concentration, where the applied pressure fell subtly wrong. They compared the natural flow of individual letters, the characteristic spacing, the small unconscious habits that every regular writer develops and that very few forgers can perfectly imitate. Slowly, methodically, the forgery gave up its secrets, the very carefulness originally intended to deceive becoming, in the end, the precise thing that ultimately betrayed it. There is, in this particular corner of the era's truth hunting, something the many other methods so often lacked, a real and genuinely honest rigor. This was not skull reading, nor summoned spirits, but genuine, careful, methodical observation, a method that truly could, with sufficient skill, distinguish a false hand from a true one. It pointed meaningfully toward a real emerging science of physical evidence, toward a future world that would eventually learn to catch its liars not by staring intently at their faces, but by studying, with real patience and genuine care, the plain physical traces they inevitably left behind on the page. The restless body, sit still, please. For your own sake, sit still. In the broader Victorian theory of deception, the body simply could not keep a secret to save its own life. A tapping foot, a ringing hand, a collar tugged nervously at the neck, a subtle, unconscious shift of weight, each one was read as guilt quite literally trying to wriggle its way out into the open air. Entire professional reputations were built on the confident claim that a skilled observer could reliably spot a liar purely by their small, involuntary fidgets. The trouble, naturally enough, was that essentially everyone fidgets when a self-appointed expert is staring intently at them, quietly narrating each small twitch to an attentive room. This particular belief ran through the entire century like a persistent connecting thread. The deep conviction that, while the tongue might readily lie, the rest of the body somehow could not, and that whatever truth a person tried hardest to conceal would inevitably leak out through their restless hands and shifting feet, regardless of how carefully they guarded their actual spoken words. The mouth in this framework was understood to be the liar's chosen instrument, but the rest of the body, the reasoning went, had never quite learned the art of lying, and so it reliably betrayed the mouth's careful deceptions. A person might say all the correct, reassuring things in a perfectly calm and even voice, and yet if their fingers kept plucking nervously at a button, if their foot simply would not remain still, if they could not keep their restless hands away from their own face, then the watchful observer felt entirely confident he had caught the truth escaping through the visible cracks. So the careful study of the involuntary fidget developed into its own small, dedicated science of suspicion. The trained truth hunter watched not the spoken words themselves, but the body surrounding them, carefully cataloging every small twitch and subtle shift. The hand that rose unconsciously to cover the mouth, as though physically attempting to push a lie back inside. The foot that tapped out some hidden, unspoken agitation. The fingers that twisted a handkerchief steadily into shreds. The collar tugged repeatedly, as though it had suddenly grown uncomfortably tight. The gaze that flicked repeatedly toward the door. The body weight that shifted restlessly from one foot to the other. Every small, restless movement of a person visibly under strain was carefully noted, weighed, and read as a silent confession. The mouth had proven too clever or too disciplined to make aloud. Picture yourself under this particular kind of scrutiny, keenly aware that your every small movement is being closely studied and actively interpreted. You try consciously to hold entirely still, and at once your own body seems to rebel against you, an itch you must absolutely not scratch, a foot that suddenly longs to tap, a terrible new awareness of your own hands and genuinely no idea what to do with them. The harder you strive for perfect stillness, the more unnatural and stiff that very stillness becomes, and somehow it reads as just as suspicious as ordinary fidgeting would have. There is, in a very real sense, no way to win. To move at all is to appear guilty, and to hold rigidly, unnaturally still is to appear guilty of visibly trying not to move. And here the whole underlying theory reveals its now familiar flaw, for the human body fidgets under strain of essentially every kind, not guilt alone. An entirely innocent person, genuinely frightened of being wrongly accused, twists and shifts and tugs at their clothing in exactly the same way a genuinely guilty person does, driven by precisely the same underlying current of simple fear. The naturally shy and the naturally anxious fidget constantly, at nearly every moment of social pressure, having absolutely nothing whatsoever to hide. A person might tap their foot from simple cold, from ordinary boredom, from a naturally restless temperament, or from the sheer accumulated discomfort of being closely watched by someone actively hunting their every small movement for signs of a lie. The fidget, in the end, revealed only that the body felt uneasy, never why it felt that way. The quivering needle in the newest and strangest laboratories of the era, scientists had noticed something genuinely eerie. When a person experienced a sudden jolt of strong emotion, the very electrical properties of their skin seemed to shift measurably in response. Researchers such as Charles Feyre and Ivan Tarchinoff attached delicate wires to willing volunteers and watched a sensitive needle jump visibly at a startling word or a sudden guilty thought. The effect was faint, flickering, and genuinely difficult to fully interpret, and it stands today as the distant, direct ancestor of the machines that would one day claim, with considerably more confidence than was strictly warranted, to pull a lie directly from a single human fingertip. The body, it seemed, quietly hummed with electricity whenever it was actively concealing something. This particular line of investigation represented a considerably stranger and more genuinely modern frontier than the skull readers and spirit mediums we've already discussed, since it reached towards something authentically real. The broader age of electricity was dawning across Europe, and curious scientists had naturally begun to wonder whether the human body, too, carried its own invisible electrical currents that shifted measurably with changing emotion. Working within careful laboratory conditions, they attached fine wires to the skin of willing volunteer subjects and connected those wires to sensitive galvanometers, delicate instruments whose needles would quiver visibly at even the faintest electrical change. Then they watched closely, and what they found proved quietly astonishing. When a subject was genuinely startled, frightened, or emotionally stirred, the electrical properties of their skin shifted measurably, and the sensitive needle moved in direct response. A French researcher named Charles Feyre discovered that a small electrical current passed carefully through the skin met noticeably less resistance when a subject was emotionally aroused, almost as though strong feeling itself opened a clearer path for the current to flow through. A Russian physiologist named Ivan Tarchinoff separately found that the skin generated its own faint electrical currents, currents that rose and fell in step with the changing tides of emotion. Neither researcher fully understood the underlying biological mechanism at the time, but both had genuinely stumbled onto something real, that the body's electrical state is intimately bound up with its emotional state, and that a strong feeling, even a carefully hidden one, leaves behind a real and measurable trace upon the skin. The sweat glands, stirred into activity by fear or excitement, were quietly altering the skin's electrical conductivity, though the fuller scientific explanation for this effect would only emerge considerably later. For the era's truth hunters, the promise contained in this discovery proved genuinely intoxicating. And this time, unlike so many of the methods before it, it rested on considerably firmer ground than any skull bump ever had. If a hidden, unspoken emotion could reliably move the needle, and if guilt itself represented a particular kind of hidden emotion, then perhaps a lie might finally be caught, not through reading a face or listening carefully to a heart, but by measuring the silent, involuntary electricity moving quietly through the skin itself. Speak a genuinely dangerous word, name the crime directly, and watch closely to see whether the needle leaps as the underlying guilty feeling stirs beneath the surface. Here, at last, was the dream of a true mechanical truth machine drawing genuinely closer, no longer resting purely on inherited superstition, but on something authentically happening within the living body. And yet the old, familiar flaw waited patiently even here, now dressed in considerably more convincing scientific clothing. The needle moved reliably with strong emotion, certainly, but it could not reliably distinguish one particular emotion from another. It could not tell apart a genuinely guilty man's fear of being caught from an entirely innocent man's fear of being wrongly blamed. Both men felt precisely the same involuntary jolt when the dangerous word was spoken aloud. Both sent the sensitive needle leaping in exactly the same fashion. The instrument itself was entirely real. The underlying electrical current was entirely real. The physical reaction it recorded was entirely real. And yet the ultimate meaning of that reaction remained just as frustratingly slippery as it had ever been. It amounted in the end to a finer, considerably more accurate scale, one capable of weighing raw fear with real precision, and still fundamentally incapable of telling you what exactly that fear was actually made of. The question of madness in the long, looming shadow cast by the Victorian asylum lurked a genuinely grim and dangerous question. Was this particular person truly and clinically insane, or merely performing madness convincingly in order to dodge the hangman's noose, the harsh conditions of the workhouse, or some deeply inconvenient forced marriage? The physicians of the mind, known formally as alienists, were handed the genuinely near impossible task of reliably telling authentic insanity apart from a merely clever performance of it. They devised carefully probing conversations and deliberately unexpected tests, forever hunting for the small crack that might reveal the underlying performance for what it truly was. It amounted, in practice, to an extraordinarily high-stakes guessing game, one in which being believed could genuinely save a person's life, and being doubted could just as easily end it, with the crucial line between the two drawn in the end by a comparative stranger. The Victorian asylum stood as one of the genuinely darkest and most sobering settings in which the era's broader obsession with truth was put directly on trial, for here the stakes could scarcely have been higher. To be formally judged truly insane might mean lifelong confinement, entirely stripped of personal freedom and social standing, shut away permanently behind high, forbidding walls. Yet to be judged fully sane, when a plea of insanity represented one's only realistic legal defense, might instead mean the gallows, a lengthy prison sentence, or some other fate a person was genuinely desperate to escape. Into this terrible, high-stakes gap stepped the alienist, the physician specifically responsible for judging the state of a person's mind, charged with the near-impossible task of determining who was genuinely, clinically mad, and who was merely and skillfully pretending, a single professional judgment that could quite literally mean the difference between continued life and imminent death. The reasons a person might choose to feign madness were genuinely numerous and often deeply pressing. A condemned criminal might reasonably hope that a formal verdict of insanity would spare him the noose entirely. A person facing the genuine misery of the workhouse, or some other equally grim fate, might see in a diagnosis of madness a strange but real form of shelter. And more troublingly still, the accusation of madness could also be deliberately turned against a perfectly sane person, wielded specifically to be rid of an inconvenient spouse, a troublesome relative, or an heir who happened to stand inconveniently in someone else's way. So that a perfectly sound and rational person might find themselves genuinely fighting to prove a sanity that others held a powerful personal interest in denying them. Truth in this particular setting became deeply tangled with fear, with money, and with personal freedom, and essentially everyone present in the room might have their own private reason to deceive. So the practicing alienist developed his own careful art of detection, observing a suspected patient with a genuinely careful and appropriately suspicious eye. He would engage them in extended conversation, probing patiently for internal consistency, for the true underlying shape of a genuinely disordered mind as distinct from the somewhat clumsy imitation of one. He understood that authentic madness tended to follow its own particular patterns and internal rhythms, patterns that proved genuinely difficult for a mere pretender to convincingly counterfeit over any extended period. He watched carefully for the exact moment a sustained performance might slip, a sudden flash of shrewd, calculating awareness behind otherwise wild-seeming eyes, a piece of theatrical raving that somehow failed to fit together as a genuine affliction naturally would. He set small, deliberately unexpected tests, posed sudden and unanticipated questions, forever hunting for the crack that might reveal either a perfectly sane mind hiding carefully behind an assumed mask, or a genuinely disordered mind hiding behind an outwardly deceptive calm. Picture the full ordeal from within, whether you happen to be genuinely suffering or desperately performing suffering out of real fear. If you are genuinely ill, you must somehow find a way to convince a fundamentally doubting professional stranger that your torment is entirely authentic, all while understanding that genuine madness, by its very nature, often cannot argue its own case clearly or persuasively. If you are, in fact, feigning your condition, you must sustain your performance under the close, trained gaze of an expert specifically trained to see through exactly this kind of deception, never quite knowing which of his apparently gentle questions conceals the real trap. And if you are entirely sane but wrongly accused, you face perhaps the cruelest task of all, attempting to prove your own basic soundness of mind to a man who has already been told you are mad, when your very protest against that judgment may itself be read as a further symptom confirming it. The verdict of reputation. In the end, the single most powerful lie detector operating throughout all of Victorian England was not any machine, any measured skull, or any summoned spirit. It was, quite simply, your own reputation. Your entire standing in life, whether you could be broadly trusted at all, was ultimately decided by neighbors, employers, and ordinary gossips who had spent years quietly weighing your every word and action. A single well-placed rumor could easily outweigh an entire lifetime of demonstrated honesty. A good name, once genuinely cracked, proved nearly impossible to properly mend. You might successfully dodge the phrenologist and outwit the visiting medium, but you could never entirely escape the slow, patient, ongoing verdict of what people quietly said about you the moment you left the room. For all of this century's considerable fascination with faces, skulls, and racing hearts, the truest and most reliable test of a person's actual honesty required no special instrument whatsoever. It was simply reputation, the slow, steady accumulation of everything a person had ever said and done, gathered and weighed, and passed steadily from mouth to mouth until it eventually hardened into the thing people simply knew, without further question, about that person. In a world of tightly bound communities and genuinely long memories, where families frequently lived for generations along the very same streets, and where everyone's business was, in a real sense, quietly everyone else's business too, a person was ultimately judged not by a single moment's blush, but by the entire long record of their life, exactly as others had chosen to remember and pass it along. This arrangement made reputation function as a kind of court that genuinely never adjourned. Its jury consisted of neighbors and employers, of gossips gathered at the local market and quiet whisperers lingering after church, all of them steadily and continuously gathering evidence, year after year. Every promise kept or broken, every debt honestly paid or quietly dodged, every small kindness and every small slight was carefully noted, stored away, and folded permanently into the eventual verdict. And once that verdict had genuinely been reached, it tended to cling stubbornly. A good name lifted a person considerably, opening doors, securing loans and advantageous marriages and desirable positions, purchasing the genuinely priceless gift of simply being believed without question. A ruined name, by contrast, shut essentially every door at once, so thoroughly that a person known widely as a liar would find themselves disbelieved even when speaking the plainest, most straightforward truth. The particular cruelty built into this informal court lay in just how little direct control any individual held over its ongoing proceedings. Your reputation lived not in your own hands, but in the mouths of others, shaped as much by circulating rumor as by verified fact, genuinely vulnerable to a single well-aimed lie told by someone with an interest in damaging you. A false whisper, cleverly and deliberately placed, could easily outweigh years of demonstrably honest living, and you might never even learn who had originally spoken it, or precisely what had been said. You could not cross-examine a rumor directly. You could not confront the gossip who had quietly condemned you, since the actual condemnation reliably happened just out of earshot, in the moment immediately after you had left the room. And a name once genuinely cracked proved dreadfully difficult to fully mend, since people tend to cling considerably more tightly to the worst thing they have heard about someone than to the best. Picture living permanently under this quiet, essentially ceaseless judgment, knowing full well that your entire standing in the world ultimately rested on what unseen others chose to say about you the moment your back was turned. You would guard your given word carefully, keep your promises scrupulously, tend to your good name as though it were a genuinely fragile and precious possession, because you understood clearly that it represented the true foundation of your entire life among other people, worth considerably more than money, and a great deal easier to lose than to ever properly regain. So this, in the end, is where our long night's parade of Victorian truth tests finally arrives at the plainest, and in its own way, the most genuinely powerful detector of all. Not the skull, nor the summoned spirit, nor the trembling galvanometer needle, but simply the accumulated memory of one's neighbors and the accumulated weight of one's own name. The Victorians spent an entire century hunting for honesty in faces and palms and racing heartbeats, and never quite managed to find it reliably there, all along. It had been living exactly where it has always lived, in the slow, patient, and frequently unforgiving verdict of how a person has actually treated the people around them, written not in skull bumps or ink or electrical sparks, but in the long, accumulated human memory of everyone who has ever quietly watched them and, in time, made up their own mind. And so you find yourself, at last, having made it through an entire long night in a world thoroughly convinced it could read you like a printed page. You were judged by the shape of your own nose, gently kneaded like bread dough by a confident stranger's skilled fingers, quietly betrayed by your own rising blush, and silently convicted by the ordinary dampness of your own palms. Your handwriting, apparently, informed on you. Your racing heart, apparently, testified against you. A stranger swung a bright coin gently before your eyes and waited patiently for your soul to spill loose. And somewhere, in a darkened room, a table tipped, and a departed spirit was solemnly asked whether or not you could be trusted. Every part of you, it seems, was placed on trial over the course of this single night, and not one of your many accusers ever quite thought to simply ask you directly, and then genuinely listen to your answer. And here, perhaps, is the strange, quietly tender truth sitting underneath the entire story. They were wrong, again and again, in 100 different confident ways. The skull bumps meant nothing real at all. The blush condemned the shy while quietly freeing the shameless. The solemn oath bound only those who had never truly needed binding in the first place. For all of their careful charts and precise calipers and swinging coins, the Victorians never actually did manage to find honesty reliably written on a face, or neatly folded into the lines of a palm, because it was never really there to be found in the first place. Honesty does not live within the body. It lives, instead, in what a person freely chooses to do when no one at all happens to be measuring them. And yet, it is hard not to feel a certain gentle fondness for them nonetheless. These earnest, occasionally quite ridiculous people, squinting so intently at one another's eyebrows, so genuinely desperate to know precisely who deserved their trust. They wanted, in the end, exactly the same thing you want, the very same thing people have always wanted throughout history: to trust others without being foolishly deceived, to be believed without being wrongly doubted. They simply reached, in their own moment in history, for skulls and séances and swinging coins, because they genuinely had nothing better available to them yet, groping earnestly toward a kind of understanding that would take another full century to even properly begin to develop. So tonight, as you settle gently into your own soft, warm bed, entirely unmeasured and unjudged, your face belonging fully to you, your handwriting standing as nobody's evidence against you, perhaps spare a gentle, quiet thought for them. For the nervous, entirely honest souls who blush their own way straight into groundless suspicion. For the naturally shy who fidgeted helplessly beneath a stranger's confident, appraising gaze. For everyone who ever stood trembling in a formal witness box, guilty of absolutely nothing beyond simple human fear. They endured together, an entire world that read confident confessions into every small involuntary twitch, and they carried on regardless, being simply and fully human anyway, blushing, sweating, hopping, loving, and quietly telling the truth even when no machine of the age could ever properly prove it. Because in the end, genuine honesty was never really a thing that could be caught, measured, or mechanically detected. It was only ever, and remains only ever, a thing a person could freely choose. And that, perhaps, stands as the most quietly comforting mystery of this entire long story. Rest well.